Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today here virtually at Duke University. We will be discussing an important matter, but one which sometimes does not reach the front pages of the mainstream media. It is nevertheless a matter of great importance, not just to the Horn of Africa, but conceivably to the wider world as well. I am joined today by three extraordinary experts. Our two invited panelists are Susan Stigant, who is the director of the Africa program at the U.S. Institute of Peace, in which position she has oversight for the Institute's programs in the Greater Horn of Africa, the issues of regional engagement and relations and activities with the Africa Union. She will be joined as a panelist by Ambassador Alberto Fernandez, who is currently the vice president of the Middle East Media Institute, is the former president of the Middle East Broadcast Network, a U.S. government news agency, a former ambassador to Equatorial Guinea, and relevant to today's program, the Chargé in the Sudan. From Duke, we will be joined by Professor Erika Weinthal. She is a specialist in environmental and public policy with a particular emphasis on water and energy. Her work has been widely published. She's won many awards, and she's also a member of the UNEP's expert group on conflict and peace building. So we have three tremendous experts with us today as we consider the challenges in the Blue Nile area, which largely, I think, escape sort of major media attention, but in particular, for now essentially a decade, there has been building tensions between or among Ethiopia, Egypt, and the Sudan. Recently, in fact, there has even been speculation that some combination of factors could lead to a dramatic deterioration in relations between and among the countries of that sub-region. And at the heart of the concern is the issue of whether the dam being constructed by Ethiopia, in fact, threatens the security of both Egypt and the Sudan, specifically food security. The dam is now, as I understand it, about 85% complete. And there is worry in particular that when it is fully, when it is full, it will actually precipitate a drought in, one might say, yet another drought in a part of the world in which water security is a matter of critical importance. So with that by way of preamble, I would like to turn to Susan Stigant of the U.S. Institute of Peace to give us some opening remarks and to report on a recent study completed by the Institute. Susan.
Great. Thank you, Patrick, and good morning to everybody. It's nice to be back virtually at Duke. I did my graduate studies at a joint program between Duke and UNC, so it's a little bit like coming home. I wanted to talk a little bit about the broader dynamics that we see in the Horn of Africa and East Africa, and the interconnections that are increasingly seen between the Horn and the Gulf states across the Red Sea. And I don't want to complicate what you've already laid out as an incredibly complex set of questions, but I think the the competition and the lack of resolution on the issue related to the Nile and the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, the GERD, is being animated by a set of political dynamics and reshaping that's taking place in the Horn. It's also animating those shifts and power dynamics and changes. And so what I wanted to share was some insights from a study group that USIP convened of former leaders from defense, diplomacy, and development to think about the increased interconnection between the Gulf and the Horn and the implications for peace and stability in a really critical part of the world for U.S. national security interests, and then to outline a blueprint of how the U.S. could approach this issue strategically going forward. So let me lay out some of the kind of key trends. There are 6 of those that the study group looked at, and then a little bit around why this should matter for the United States and for international peace and security broadly. So the first is that the regional order is fundamentally shifting in the Horn of Africa. And we see that the security systems in the Middle East, even in the Indo-Pacific and up into the Mediterranean, are increasingly interlinked together. And this is having a fundamental impact on competition and influence in the Red Sea. We've seen this significantly with the development of ports all along the coast of the Red Sea and competition for who is investing there. The second critical development and finding that the study group looked at were Middle Eastern rivalries. As many people are familiar, there's been a significant cleavage amongst Gulf countries that was animated by the war in Yemen. There's some developments that suggest that there might be some rapprochement between the two sort of main poles of that division, with the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia on the one hand and Qatar and Turkey on the other. But what we saw was that a concern that as the competition got stronger and the division deeper, that this could play out and be replicated in the Horn of Africa. And I think we've seen the really tragic consequences of the impact of the competition in Yemen, and had concerns that during Sudan's own transition, that aligning these different forces to ensure that they weren't pushing in different directions was really critical to leading to the peaceful agreement on how to take forward Sudan's transition over the next several years. So this relates to the third finding, which highlights the really once in a generation political transitions that are happening in the Horn of Africa. Ethiopia, on the one hand, that after years of authoritarian rule, a Cold War between Ethiopia and Eritrea, moved and made signals towards a great opening. Political prisoners were released. Prime Minister Abiy was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And there was great hope that this country of hundreds of millions of people, 150 million is sort of the best estimate, was moving in the direction of accountable governance and democracy, and would be a stronger anchor for peace and stability in the region. Sudan's revolution also signaled really courageous efforts on the part of young people and old people across the entire country going to the streets and calling for the end of President al-Bashir's rule. And so these are really incredible transitions, but they're extremely fragile as well. And I think we've seen that over the last several months, particularly in Ethiopia with the crisis in Tigray. The next key finding relates to demographics. The population in the Horn of Africa is projected to grow by 44% in the next 15 years and 87% over the next 30. And so if we think about these protest movements that led to the change in Sudan, if we look at the youth population in Ethiopia and in other parts of the Horn, these are populations that consistently express their desire for democratic, accountable governance in public opinion research. They also express the deep need for economic reforms, to have jobs that match the education and training that they're receiving. And they wish to have a political voice. So it's not just about jobs. It's not just about money and financing to take care of their families and communities. It's about fundamentally having a say in what their relationship is with the state and what the state does for them. And then the final finding relates to the United States. The study group observed that there is really not a coherent US political strategy that understands the interconnection between these countries. Often the US is working on a bilateral basis. And more importantly, that captures the dynamics that go across the Red Sea. In many ways, the US government bureaucracy is set up so that the Red Sea is the border. It's the end of Africa and it's the beginning of the Near East. And in reality, the Red Sea is the highway. It's the highway of politics. It's the highway of economics. It's the highway of social. It's the highway of people who are moving across. And so the study group recommends that the United States really needs a new blueprint, a new political strategy. And this is animated, I think, by a longstanding commitment of the values and the potential of the transitions that are taking place in the Horn. This is in line with what the United States projects in its foreign policy. And that's reflected by the deep investment. The US spent $1.3 billion in Egypt in security partnerships in 2020. Between 2017 and 2019, $1.7 billion. And that doesn't even account for peacekeeping missions in Somalia, in South Sudan, 2 missions in Sudan. And so the economic investment is massive. If you also look at the humanitarian assistance in South Sudan alone, which also falls along the Nile, over $1 billion a year of assistance is provided. And so the study group makes the case that there needs to be a blueprint, a political strategy that acknowledges this geopolitical change, that this needs to be headed and led by ideally an envoy that can work across the different bureaucracies, that the United States needs to align its assistance behind this so that the driving force of accountable governance is supported by both security, development, and humanitarian assistance. And that the United States can play a critical role in animating conversations in multilateral institutions related to debt relief and refinancing, particularly in the COVID era. Or elevating some of these issues in forums so that it can support the emergence of some sort of security architecture that can acknowledge and address these challenges. And finally, the report called for continued leadership by Congress, by the US Congress on these issues, so that it can activate across its committees that are also divided between Africa and the Near East, that it can bring to bear some of its necessary reporting mechanisms on arms flows and purchases and the flow of money that may be taking place between the Gulf and the Horn. And these are indicators of potentially destabilizing dynamics that could fundamentally disrupt what we see as a great potential. But even more these days, we know the great risks, both with the crisis that's taking place in Tigray and Ethiopia, the risk of a border conflict between Sudan and Ethiopia, and the GERD. I think that we'll get into a bit more. So Patrick, I hope that wasn't too much information, but hopefully that provides a bit of a regional backdrop of where the dynamics and the political dynamics of the Nile situate in this broader dynamic.
Thank you, Susan. That was really a terrific scene setter for us. I've been reminded that I should make a couple of quick points before we move to Ambassador Fernandez. First, we are reserving about 20 minutes, maybe a bit more, for questions and answers from the audience. Please use the Q&A function on your screen for those questions, and we will get to as many of them as possible during the final portion of the program. Also, I just want to mention that this program was initially organized by the Duke Center for International and Global Studies under the general rubric of Rethinking Diplomacy. I'm on the Duke faculty and a fellow in the Rethinking Diplomacy Program. So with that clarification on the administration of the rest of our session this morning, Alberto, how would you respond to some of what Susan has, I think, so vividly outlined, and in particular, if you have any insights on what, for instance, Senator Coons, who was recently dispatched to the area by President Biden, what he might accomplish, and what, in fact, you think his priorities should be.
Yeah, sure. I mean, first of all, I mean, I don't want to nitpick the report, but I would caution. It's almost fashionable in Washington to drag in the kind of the Gulf states and their problems into the issues of other parts of the world. And certainly there's no doubt that the competition among Gulf states has a kind of international dimension that goes beyond the Arab world. But the relationships and competition between Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia are not, are overwhelmingly generated and have to be seen within the context of local actors that have their own agency, that do their own things. We only have to think back that 150 years ago, Egypt was actually trying to conquer Ethiopia, as difficult as that is to believe, and in fact had a North Carolinian, a former Confederate general, helping them try to do so. As bizarre as that is, so the kind of competition between these three great large countries, that today have about 300 million people between them, is a very old one. And, it goes back even farther, Nile civilization and all of its complexities and all of that have like kind of long roots. I see the issue as I said, despite the role of outside players, both benign and malign, I see this as kind of being driven by realities on the ground, not by three fragile, conflicted states, but actually by four. There's the role of Egypt, there's the role of Sudan, there's the role of Ethiopia, there's the role of Eritrea. And I think the role of Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia is complex. They all have their internal complexities, and there's conflict and a struggle for power in one way or another going on in all three of those states. The totally malign regional player is Eritrea, which is certainly playing a very negative role, I think, and that is sometimes ignored. So that's the way I see it. You could say instead of a three-sided conundrum, it's a four-sided conundrum. Now, what should the U.S. focus on, whether Coons or whether Jeff Feltman, who has been, mentioned as the new kind of possible special envoy, who has who's a former American diplomat, has a Middle East background and a strong UN background. Coons' visit, which is, a much more, recent thing to happen. I think there's several things that jump out at me. Number one is, as dire as the situation is, as menacing as it is, it could get so much worse. So there's a real opportunity to kind of walk this all back to a situation where at least it doesn't explode into all-out war, which could certainly happen on the Sudanese-Ethiopian border at any time. You have regular armed forces, tribal militias, irregular special forces. You had Egypt holding war games with the Sudan in November. You have Eritrea playing its own kind of destructive role. All of that going on at the same time. And so I would say that for me, I think the most immediate thing for a visitor or a special envoy would be to try to walk the parties back a bit, especially, I think, Abiy Ahmed. I think he's in a situation which is, I think, incredibly volatile within Ethiopia and with Ethiopia's neighbors. Sudan, I think the challenge there is not so much the role of the UAE or the Gulf states in Sudan. The challenge in Sudan is you have a transition towards democracy, which is underway. You have the role of the military, and you have struggles going on, not just between civilians and military, but within military forces themselves. So it's between the SAF and the RSF, between Burhan and Daglu going on as well. So you have kind of multiple layers going on. So the United States needs to basically, I think, provide an off-ramp for Abiy Ahmed, because kind of upfront, needs to reassure and reassert our commitment to a democratic transition in Sudan. And of course, more broadly, has to reassure everyone, including the Egyptians. The Egyptians were the, favored of the three, the favored child in the previous American administration. The expectation now is that, or was, that Egypt was going to be the bad guy in this scenario. But what happened? We've had bloody, savage conflict in Ethiopia, which has totally upset the kind of the vision that people had. Instead of this being about a conflict about water, which certainly is, and about the GERD and water scarcity and water assurance along the Nile Valley, from the Blue Nile all the way up to Egypt. You have that, you have the border war dimension, and you have the internal civil war kind of bloody, savage conflict in Ethiopia as well on top of that. So what was, until very recently, a very complicated and difficult conflict about water and the development and all of those things has had a kind of a more immediate military security, human rights dimension added on top of what was already a very devilish, complicated situation involving, possibilities of drought, water panic in the Nile Valley, perceptions. There's a kind of scientific view of what's going on and kind of popular perceptions that, we're losing out, our water's being taken by those guys. So I think the first thing that has to happen is kind of a real need to put the brakes on the situation, which is already very volatile and dangerous, getting even worse, where it actually breaks out into all-out war between one or several of these parties.
Thanks very much for that. Erika, let me turn to you, please.
Okay. Thank you, Alberto and Susan, for those introductory remarks and setting the stage. I'm going to kick it off with one question and then open it up to some of the questions that are coming in from our participants. And I want to ask, because this is being hosted in many ways by the Rethinking Diplomacy Program, and to have you put on your diplomatic hats and think about, and help us understand what would a new approach to diplomacy in this part of the world look like, and particularly in light of, it's been so tumultuous over the last few months with the end of the Trump administration, the movement into the Biden administration, with the Trump administration initially withholding aid to Ethiopia over the GERD, and the Biden administration reinstating aid to Ethiopia, or similarly to canceling the policies of the Trump administration vis-a-vis Yemen too. But also recently today, which was really interesting in the news, we had seen too that Sudan had cleared its arrears with the arm of the IDA, the arm of the World Bank, that would allow it once again to be eligible for funding. And so there's all these opportunities now to re-engage in this part of the world with a new diplomatic lens, with new, potentially with different tools. And so I would be curious to think about, what does it mean to rethink diplomacy, in this potentially new era, when it comes to potentially leveraging water in the Nile, or even more broadly?
That is to whom? To
both of you. So whoever, I would like, both of you to think, what would be a new diplomatic approach, that the Biden administration, or, even more broadly, the broader international community, now that, Sudan is eligible for different forms of finance, global finance.
Well, Sudan is eligible for that because of the Trump administration. because of the deal, the normalization deal with Israel. That is a benefit of that deal. It's one of the three big benefits that Sudan got from it. One of them being obviously removed from the terrorism list. The other one getting kind of sovereign immunity against being sued by Americans who have been hurt by the former terrorist regime in Sudan, the Bashir regime, which is one of the worst regimes in Sudanese history. So obviously, and this maybe is showing my Sudanese bias. There's a low-hanging fruit, which is Ethiopia is in savage, bloody civil war. Egypt is a full-on authoritarian state it's even more authoritarian than it was in the past. More of a kind of military-run state in the past. Sudan is the one of the three that is in transition. So at the very least, if we're talking about diplomacy, kind of the most obvious thing is to get the transitory, fragile situation in Sudan right. If you're able to get that one working, that has all sorts of benefits. For example, Sudan has been driven for a variety of very complicated reasons, and Susan and others may want to talk about it. Sudan has basically flipped from leaning towards Ethiopia to leaning towards Egypt. Would it be much better if Sudan basically could play a positive role, because it's in between the two, a democratic Sudan that respects human rights, that is a good neighbor to both of those countries, could kind of, turn down the temperature a bit. So I would say that's a kind of a diplomatic task that is upfront that the international community needs to get right. That's on the plus side. On the negative side, I think, and I don't want to harp on it too much, I think disconnecting Abiy Ahmed from Eritrea is something which has to happen. There was so much hope about Ahmed and Ethiopia and the future of it, and the Nobel Prize winner. In fact, he played a very positive role in Sudan as well, in Sudan's transition. And yet now he's come into this Faustian bargain with, probably the North Korea of Africa. Which does not bode well for not just for Ethiopia, but for the region.
Susan, what do you think of that?
Yeah, I think it's a massive diplomatic challenge for anybody taking it on and wrestling with it. And I'm heartened to see that the Biden administration is giving signals early on that they're planning to address this. I agree with Ambassador Fernandez that this is that the ensuring that the guardrails remain on the Sudan transition and with civilian leadership is a critical part in this puzzle. I do think that that having the United States signaling its commitment to sort of norms and principles that have been established and providing clear support for leadership from the African Union will be an important piece of this puzzle. The African Union has established these norms and principles. It has set forward norms related to border. These border questions are fundamentally being pushed and renegotiated in the context of the dispute within Ethiopia and on the questions between Sudan and Ethiopia. In theory, having a foreign intervention like Eritrea's involvement in Ethiopia should be something that triggers the international community to really pay attention and activate. But there are a number of reasons that it's quite difficult, I think, for the AU to be out in front. And this is where the international system needs to work together. The UN Security Council, you often get into this circular conversation where the United States and some of the other permanent members wait for a signal for what African leadership wants and the direction that they want to take this. And so I think that that's an important piece of this puzzle. And I want to go back to one of the notes about the role of Gulf countries. And I fully agree, our African colleagues have agency, they're the leads on this. We came to this work on the Red Sea because we heard from our colleagues at the African Union, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, the Regional Economic Community. Their greatest concern was not interference of China or Russia. Their greatest concern was interference by and the risk that engagement by Gulf countries might push things away from civilian-led transitions or from democratization or accountable governance. And so I think we need to hear that concern. It doesn't take away responsibility or agency from African institutions or leaders, but helping to develop a coherent approach. And in some ways, the US is quite singularly placed to shield and to ensure that if the Emiratis and the Qataris and Turkey are engaged in the Horn, which they are very robustly, that is pushing in that same direction that we know really adds up to longer term peace and stability.
Erika, do you have a follow-up?
I am going to build on, just because this is about the Nile, I feel like we should talk a little bit about the Nile. And we've been, it's been advertised as Blue Nile, but Sudan is White Nile. So we're just going to look at the Nile Basin. And we've had a lot of questions coming in specifically about the Nile. And for a long time, the Nile Basin Initiative was the platform for trying to manage the new conflicts that were emerging over the use of the Nile waters. In light of the fact that, the only existing treaty that, is between Egypt and Sudan, and Ethiopia in many ways is calling that into question. So, what would be, I guess, how do you look at just the management of the Nile moving forward, just very broadly? What are the main issues that need to be addressed at this point? Especially, Ethiopia has already, started filling the GERD, so you can't revert back. What role would Sudan play at this point? Given this, privileging or that Sudan has a more prominent role in this area. So, how could what would a new treaty look like? And who would be the right, what would be the right forum for trying to negotiate this? Would it be with the US reinserting itself, trying to be a neutral mediator? Would it be through the World Bank? Would it be through the African Union?
I think that's a terrific question. Let me add to it for our two panelists that the way I've been sort of puzzling over this is to ask myself, does a solution or does progress in that region effectively run through the dam? And I'll leave it at that. Yeah. Alberto, would you like to take that on?
Sure, I can take that on. Look, I think that I wish I could say that the progress is through the dam and through the kind of the technical questions of the dam. But I think that the biggest issue is actually political. I think there's a deep distrust that was already existed and has existed for a decade. And the fact that Ethiopia is internally in conflict, in all-out violent conflict, will just add fuel to the fire and kind of lack of trust by the other Nile states, and not just the two. Remember, there are 11 Nile Basin countries. Are actually 11 countries that are somehow connected to the larger Nile question. But so I think that unfortunately the question, which should be entirely a technical one, has become more political. I mean, for example, if you study the scholarly work, there are very good, and I'm not a hydrologist, they're very good studies that show, for example, that the GERD is good for Sudan. That's what the science, we talk about follow the science these days, the science shows that the GERD is good for Sudan, and that maybe the GERD is probably not terrible for Egypt. In normal years, in years where there's plenty of rain and things are good, like last year was a heavy rain year on the Nile. Now, in years of drought, that's where the question becomes, that's where Egypt is afraid of water scarcity that will lead to revolution in Egypt. And the regime is concerned about being overthrown by its enemies who are going to use the water issue as a kind of rallying cry. In Sudan, the same thing. That kind of if the GERD controls Nile water flow and makes irrigation easier and helps silting not happening as bad. There are all these kind of, you could say, the mind could be convinced, but the gut, which is more political, says, we don't trust these guys. Abiy Ahmed went from everybody's, the toast of the town, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, to basically a guy who is complicit in mass murder going on in Tigray right now, and thousands of people being killed, and 1,000 people being killed in a church, one of the holiest churches in Ethiopia. Orthodox Christians killing Orthodox Christians, by the way, not somebody from some other religion. So to me, the problem is the situation has become much more political than it was. It already was political, but recent events, the border issue and internal issues in Ethiopia, have deepened the lack of trust that already existed and made it much worse, much more political than it was before.
Susan, do you have a sense of how we can sort of walk back from this? And what I would add is, it seems to me that on some level, the possibility that the U.S. could play a lead role as mediator was to some degree compromised in the last administration by the fact that the Trump administration appeared to be taking sides relatively early, somewhat earlier in the conflict than might in fact prove to be the case going forward.
Yes, I think that's true. I mean, I think the way that the engagement took place around the GERD negotiations had removed the U.S. from being seen as a neutral player, certainly the past administration. And I think, unfortunately, it also shaped and colored the ability of the U.S. to engage clearly and constructively around domestic issues in Ethiopia. And I think that we're still feeling the impacts of that reality. I mean, as a way forward, the Sudanese have proposed, and the Egyptians have supported that proposal, to move to a quartet negotiation process that, currently the African Union, under the previous chair, South Africa's leadership, had been convening the talks on the Nile. Sudan has suggested transferring this mediation to the AU, the EU, the UN, and the United States. And there's been some, an observer status for the US and the EU in the past, but this would sort of fundamentally reshape what the structure would look like. And I think that's worth looking into further. In my mind, there are going to have to be multiple negotiations and diplomatic engagements that are taking place simultaneously. Like we don't get to choose in this instance one entry point and put all the resources behind it. And I think in many ways the Nile disputes, it will be about managing, containing, and mitigating the risks that could get worse, while clearly signaling some of the key norms that need to be put back on track across the Horn of Africa. And that's a signaling to leaders in the countries. And it's a signaling to others who have a role to play and an influence that can either be positive or can be a complicating influence. And I think it's creating the space to be able to walk back all of these, sort of walk people back from the abyss that they're looking at actively. when the crisis took place in Tigray, it was shocking, and I think what's taking place is still very concerning. It's not just Tigray. This is broader. There are deep concerns about violence across Ethiopia more broadly. But in many ways, it wasn't surprising that both the federal government and the TPLF felt that they were at a moment where violence was their only choice. And we know that as parties get closer and closer, we're narrowing what they perceive as options, the risks of violence, either a mistake that escalates into something worse, or continuing to choose that because it seems like it's the only option available. So I think that the challenge before diplomats is expanding the set of options, right? Containing the risk of any sort of violence around these multiple disputes, and then resetting the norms and standards and expanding the set of options that are available.
Thank you. Erika, I know that you and I, as co-moderators, are seeing quite a number of questions. Would you like to pick one for the group?
Yeah. Susan, since you raised, the Gulf early on as, another set of actors, we have a question about the role of China and especially, China's investments through its Belt and Road Initiative, and how that might have shifted any diplomatic rivalries in the area, and, just any observations.
Yes. Ethiopia was identified as one of the priority countries by China in some of their engagement globally and in Africa in particular. They obviously have a longstanding relationship with Sudan and South Sudan. I'll say what we hear consistently from our partners in the region is that this is a conversation where there's deep concern that the discussion about global power competition will take place between the self-appointed global powers, and that it will be about Africa rather than a conversation with Africa and with Africans and African leaders. African leaders don't have the option to choose between working with one country or another. China provides really critical financing. I think there are, good and well-founded concerns about the transparency and how that financing is impacting on debt, who's receiving the benefits of those projects. And, in my view, the strongest way to approach that is to recognize that transparency is a fundamental question in good governance and accountable governance broadly. And that requires robust systems and within African countries, and ensuring that they have a fair place at the table in those conversations. So I think, generally in the global view right now, there doesn't seem to be a lot of space for, maybe little bits are opening up over the last couple of weeks, but there isn't a ton of space for constructive US-China engagement or engagement with others. A place where it happened before was in Sudan and South Sudan. There was actually quite strong partnership and Chinese engagement that helped to push towards Sudan's separation and transition, done in an orderly way, and the peace agreement that was reached in South Sudan. And so the report actually argues that this is something that should be explored and looked at in the case of the Horn of Africa. And again, I think the lead of our African partners at the AU or IGAD asking for the US and China to take particular approaches would be incredibly powerful in aligning those influences and those resources.
Alberto, if I'm not mistaken, you were actually the chargé in the Sudan during at least part of the time that some of these negotiations were taking place. Do you have a sense of whether China could play a positive role, and/or is there any possibility in the current environment of the U.S. and China operating together?
Well, that's the question. When I was there, China was basically, China is obviously, as Susan pointed out, China was very important for Sudan, was the chief recipient of Sudanese oil, which was both, came from South Sudan. Sudan was one country when I was there. And China, was a, military backer of the Sudanese government, et cetera. It was the Americans who actually brought in China as a diplomatic partner towards trying to take ownership of the CPA, the Comprehensive Peace Accords, which led to, a peace in Sudan, between the South and the North, to try to kind of make the Chinese a positive player in the process. And the Americans succeeded, and the Chinese did not play a bad role. I mean, I think that I would not exaggerate their role. The role was not the principal role. The U.S. and others had a much more kind of more heft. The challenge is a broader one, which is in the changed international environment that we live in, which has two elements, which is China has much more clout than it did a decade ago. And the kind of the competition between the U.S. and China is much more acute, or sees much more rough and much more out in the open than it was before. How do those two new dimensions manifest themselves on the ground in the Horn of Africa? Worst case scenario is, the Americans have their guys and the Chinese have their guys. That would be utterly disastrous. That would be putting oil on a raging fire. I think the smarter way is, as Susan pointed out, is to get them to be a partner into kind of this whole gambit of ongoing processes. And if we look at Sudan's peace process as kind of not the model, but a model, Sudan's peace process, which took forever and which ended the longest civil war in African history at the time, involved the United States, involved IGAD, involved all of Sudan's neighbors at some point in one way or another, involved countries like Norway, played an important role in peace in Sudan. So the question is, yes, let's get China and others involved as positive players in the process, not as competitors in kind of a zero-sum game, but a kind of win-win situation where we're all working together to try to achieve a kind of more norm-based, diplomatic, win-win situation for everyone. It would be a disaster if it's China competing against the Americans in the region.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Erika, did you have another question?
We have one other question that is from one of our participants that's really going back to water. I want to make sure are there any other models that could be leveraged for, looking at river basins? I mean, often we use water as a tool, a diplomatic tool for helping to bring about political cooperation, or we propose that is actually a useful tool. And maybe just because both of you aren't, per se hydrologists or, international water lawyers, you may actually have a more critical perspective on this. So I'd be really curious to hear whether you think water can provide an entry point into some of these broader issues of negotiation. So this whole issue of water diplomacy, and whether there are lessons that can be learned from other water basins, including maybe in Southern Africa, or whether the African Council of Water Ministers can play a role. And either one of you, or both, it would be fantastic to get.
I think it's going to be tricky for water to be the bridging point in this instance. As the ambassador said, this has really the polarization has deepened. The rhetoric and narratives in all of the countries that are currently engaged in the negotiations have been deeply dividing. Egypt views the Nile as like one of its number one national security priorities, and Egyptians know that. Ethiopia has made the GERD a top national security priority, and Ethiopians know that. I don't think we should forget that Ethiopians actually contributed money to build the GERD, right? They took money out of their own livelihoods to contribute to this national project that was sold to them as a way to light up the country, literally light up the country. And I say sold, not as in like it was a promise that won't be kept, but there are really firmly held positions. And so I think in this instance, there are good technical fixes that have been explored, and I think we're going to have to be even more creative. Something that I wondered about is there are funding mechanisms that are increasingly looking at regional projects. regional infrastructure projects. And I think we need to actually get some of the World Bank development folks, not to negotiate and mediate. I think the World Bank would have a hard time stepping back into that role, given their past role in these talks. But people who can think about joint infrastructure projects, there's a significant water efficiency issue that drives the question and the perception of scarcity. And so is there any way that could be bridged? There's a fundamental sort of energy generation question. Is there any way that there could be a creative way to bridge this? And even if that's a short-term measure to take off some of the pressure on the narratives, the rhetorics, the stories that are driving each of the heads of state and negotiating teams to take such a strong position, I think that would be something worthy to explore.
Yeah, I agree. I think confidence building measures, there's no kind of easy solution, but confidence building measures are really something that needs to be looked at. And I don't know about Southern Africa, but I have a little bit of experience in water issues involving two other parts of the world. And one is a kind of a object lesson in what to do or what not to do. And they're both kind of strange, as although I'm from Havana originally. I'm from the Southwest, from Arizona, and in the U.S.'s relations with Mexico involving the Colorado River are fascinating. The U.S. takes so much water from the Colorado that technically, basically, it owes Mexico water when the river reaches Mexico. The U.S. has to find other ways to make that up, to fulfill its treaty obligations. So it involves kind of being a good neighbor and being creative and looking for ways to satisfy your neighbor to make sure that they're happy with the deal that exists. So confidence building measures. The negative lesson that I know is, serving in Syria is Turkey's role in damming the Tigris and Euphrates, where it's actually is a very negative role, has led to terrible, environmental and other issues downstream in both Syria and Iraq. And Syria and Iraq can't make a bigger issue out of it because basically Turkey will go to war over that. And Turkey is much stronger than either of those countries. So that's not how not to do it.
We are approaching the end of our hour. I would like to, beyond thanking all of you for participating, offer Erika one more opportunity to raise a question, but also to invite our two panelists to ever so briefly give us their sense of what the most urgent priority is today. Can a regional conflict be avoided? Whether the solution to that runs through the dam or not. And Erika, before they launch on that, did you have something you would like to ask them to touch on before we go?
Sure. First of all, I also want to thank our presenters today. This has been really insightful. And just to echo Patrick, I was going to ask, also about what you see as any other challenges, but one, that I would throw out is climate change. How should this be addressed within the context of the Nile region, especially when we've been seeing, flooding in the Sudan, locusts in East Africa, implications for food security. So if there are, other broader challenges that we should be looking at.
Okay, Susan, let's start with you.
Great. Well, thanks for the conversation. It's been wonderful to join. I think it's possible to avoid regional conflict, and I think the restraint shown by Egypt and Sudan, and I think Ethiopia on the border question, like everybody wants to avoid a fight. And I think what's critical right now is to set up those the phone lines so that if there is something that takes place, there's a way for leaders and capitals to check what those signals look like, sort of the hotline between capitals, so that, if there's a risk that something could happen at a more communal level, that it can be addressed and diffused rather than escalated. And so I think that sort of mitigation measure is probably number one. And then I think continuing the talks on the GERD, getting a structure that gives people confidence, creating some of those confidence building measures to take the polarization out of it would be really helpful in the short term. But I think some of the other pieces in the horn have to get realigned first. And so I think the attention does need to be on Ethiopia, Eritrea for the immediate future, and keeping those guardrails so that the Sudanese transition doesn't become another crisis that needs to be addressed. There's so much potential, there's so much hope, so much hard work that's gone into that, and many people who are working hard for peace in all of the countries. So making sure that we don't lose sight of those and support their work.
Alberto.
Yes, I think more immediately ensuring the war does not unintentionally start. Because Amhara militia on the border and Janjaweed on the other side of the border don't somehow start fighting each other and then drag in regular military, air forces, whatever, and it kind of deteriorates into all-out war, and they can drag in Egypt and Eritrea. That's the worst-case scenario. That's something to be avoided by, taking military kind of government to government and those types of questions. And by the way, that affects the dam question too, because one of the problems is there's that lack of trust. There's lack of information about the filling of it and all of that. And just one point on the climate change question, which I think is very important. There are all kinds of really good scientific studies on the Blue Nile and the GERD and all of that, which offer a lot of reassurance if read by the Sudanese and by the Egyptians in best case scenarios. The problem is in the worst case scenario situation, drought situation, which of course, with concerns that people have about climate change, that's the the specter behind everybody's back is, okay, fine, if there's a lot of rain, that's not going to be a problem. But what happens in the situation where there's not enough water and it's Abiy Ahmed who's fighting and who's doing all this stuff is going to decide what the water situation in Egypt is. So climate change definitely has to be addressed, and it has to be an issue in kind of worst case scenario modeling of what could happen, because that is the fear. This is driven by lack of confidence and fear by all these parties.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, this has been a fascinating discussion. For those who are viewing, we expect to do more programming through the Rethinking Diplomacy initiative on water issues and water crises around the world. Some of them will doubtless be somewhat more technical and less geopolitical, but I think this one really unavoidably required an analysis of the geopolitical considerations in that subregion. So thanks to our panelists. Erika, thank you very much for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you all again in the very near future, we hope. This concludes our program.